Good evening. My name is Tony Patesnick. I'm the Director of Public Safety for the City of New Brighton. Thanks for joining us virtually for this live community presentation. And if you're watching us on replay at a later date, we're grateful that you've taken time to learn this information. We hope that this meeting reaches a large audience in New Brighton. Tonight, we're going to share details about a level 3 sex offender who we learned just this week moved into our city. In an ideal world, we would have known this about his residency in our community before his move into New Brighton. However, once the state advises us of his presence, we were quick to schedule this meeting to better inform our residents. So thanks for being with us here. You know, consistent with our department's mission statement, I want to reaffirm our organizational goal of assuring a safe community. We believe that prevention and preparedness through public education and community engagement makes the city of New Brighton safer for everyone. We want to start by educating our residents about the Community Notification Act. And to do that, we've invited an expert on the topic from the Minnesota Department of Corrections, Mark Bliven, to explain the state's risk management system for predatory offenders. Following his presentation, we'll have a time for question and answers using the chat function on this Zoom meeting. Again, thanks for joining us tonight and making the city of New Brighton safer for everyone. Mark?
Okay, thank you. I'm very glad that to receive the invitation here to assist you in this community notification. This is something that the Department of Corrections, we assist with local law enforcement all over the state in this requirement to provide notification in the case of those assigned as a level 3. So what I'm going to do is provide a slideshow for you. And I'll talk about these slides. Some of it is just general overall, so you understand what we're talking about when I refer to somebody who's subject to registration, and some of the general overall statistics information about those who are subject to registration. And then after that, I'll go into specific details about the particular person that has moved into your community and go over some of those details, and then talk about how he's going to be supervised, part of the information on his living situation, and then we'll give you the opportunity to ask questions. The most important thing about this community notification meeting, I like to really describe it more as a community conversation. This is your opportunity as community members to find out information, get your questions asked and answered. And what we'll do is, within our ability to provide that information, we'll be doing that tonight, give you that opportunity. And there'll also be, as I understand it, members of the Public Safety Department here in New Brighton who will also be able to answer questions at the end of this presentation. So without anything further on that, what I'll do is share my screen and go through this PowerPoint slides. Okay. So we have this community notification meeting tonight, and important part of that is think of it as an education meeting too. Our agenda, I'll talk about registration, registrants in the community, what community notification is, how we do risk level assignment, particular information on the level 3 we're talking about tonight, also some resources that you can use to assist you in making sure your community is safe, and then that question period. So first thing that's really important to keep in mind is that registrants have always, those who have sexually offended have always lived in our community. almost everybody who goes to prison, 95% of those who go to prison end up coming back into our community, reintegrating back into the community. It's likely that people who are subject to registration live, work, interact in every single community in Minnesota. There are no communities that really don't have people who have returned from prison, and particularly people who have returned from prison after committing a sex offense. So the difference with those who are subject to registration is that we do track them in much more detail than we do others that commit offenses, go to prison, get out of prison. Back in 1991, we started the registration system. The legislature decided that it's important to provide a tool, an investigation tool for law enforcement to keep track of those who have a history of sexual offending. So anybody who does commit a sex offense is required to provide to local law enforcement where they live, where they're employed, where they go to school, and then any vehicles they own or operate. So registration is required of those who commit criminal sexual conduct or any sexual conduct involving a minor, which could include possession of child sexual exploitation materials. And then two offenses that don't necessarily have to be involved at all in sexual offending are the crimes of kidnapping and false imprisonment. So in Minnesota, we don't call it a sex offender registration system. It's called a predatory offender registration system. And that's just so it is not specifically tied to sexual offending because of the inclusion of the crimes of kidnapping or false imprisonment. But for the most part, those who are on the registry, the overwhelming majority of them have a sexual offense history. So how many people are subject to this registration? Over the entire history of registration since 1991, so that's 30 years, we've had about 30,000 people who have fallen under this registration requirement. Currently, there are 18,727 who are currently living in Minnesota and currently subject to registration. The others are people who have completed their registration or have moved out of state or are deceased. So as of September 15th, just to give you an idea of how many registrants there are in the area, in all of Ramsey County, there are 1,446 registrants. And 30 of those registrants live in New Brighton, but we're only talking about one of those tonight, and that's because there's one who is designated as a level 3, which means he is subject to broad public notification. To compare some of the neighboring counties, there are 552 registrants in Anoka County. There are 2,700 plus in Hennepin County and 312 in Washington County. And that gives you an idea of sort of the ratio based on population. Hennepin County is the largest county in the state, and it has the largest number of registrants. So back in 1991, we started this registration period, but then in 1997, it was enhanced with the community notification. What that meant is that the registration information since 1991 was only an internal system that law enforcement could use to investigate and track those with a history of offending. But in 1997, the legislature decided that in some cases, those who are have a higher number of risk factors associated with them should be subject to broader public notification. So any of the registrants who actually end up in prison, each one of them before they're released from prison is reviewed by a committee that looks at their background, their history, and depending on the number of risk factors associated with them, they'll assign them a designation as either a 1, 2, or 3. And this community notification, again, we have about 18,000 people who are subject to registration in Minnesota, but not all of them are subject to community notification. The key point is that only those who have gone to prison are then subject to this community notification process. So if a registrant is released from prison, whether it's in Minnesota or another state or a federal jurisdiction, they are subject to community notification assignment. Also, those who are civilly committed to the state security hospital are also subject to this registration. It does not apply to juvenile registration because juveniles will not go to prison, to an adult prison, so they're not subject to it. And also those who commit one of these registration offenses, but only serve time in a local jail or get local probation. They also don't get assigned a risk level. Thereby, they're not subject to broad public notification. So of the about 18,000 subject to registration, about half of them have been to prison and do have that risk level assigned. So in this community notification process, it's us with the Department of Corrections. We're responsible for assessing the risk and assigning those risk levels. So again, about 3 to 4 months before somebody gets out of prison, we're going to look at them, look at their entire history, not just the offense they're in prison for or a particular sex offense, but their broad behavior and any kind of risk factors that may be involved that may contribute to them being of a higher risk relative to others. What we do is prepare a report, provide all that information, and then when somebody leaves prison or moves from one community to another, we pass on that information to local law enforcement. And it's at that point that law enforcement takes on the responsibility for community notification. And the level of notification they do is based on the risk level. So the scope of the notification, if they're level 3, it's broad notification. If it's level 2, there's a moderate level of notification. And if it's level 1, it's a limited number of or level of proactive notification. So anybody who goes to prison and is subject to registration will get at least a level 1. And what that means is that when local law enforcement gets that information on a level 1, they can share that information with other law enforcement agencies. They notify victims and witnesses and others who have been designated by by the county attorney to get additional notification that this person has moved into the community or has been released from prison. They also notify other adult members of that household where that level 1 registrant is living. But other than that, there is no broad public notification. So the general public doesn't have that particular proactive notification done. Next is this moderate risk of, or the level 2. So the same thing as level 1 notification, that's all done. But then law enforcement can also, on a case-by-case basis, look at the registrant's particular offense history and make determinations about whether some specific notifications might be warranted, additional type. But again, it's not going to be broad type notification. Then we come to the level 3. And when we say higher risk, we don't mean high risk or likely to reoffend. We simply mean that this person, after review, looks like they have additional factors, things that merit additional monitoring, review, and that distribution of this information to the general public can help in this monitoring process. So the DOC puts this information about level 3s who go into the community on a statewide website that's always available to the public. You can always look up if there are level 3s living in your community. You can look up by county, by city, by the name, and you can find out those who are designated as level 3 and living in the community. Public notification meeting like this tonight is usually held. There can be coverage in the media, newspaper, radio, television, whatever. The agency website, as in the city of New Brighton, they publish information on that. Social media distribution, there could be door-to-door flyers. This information that's being shared tonight can be shared by anybody and with anybody because it's been made public tonight. So when we look at those risk levels, just to give you an idea, about 15% of those leaving prison are designated as a level 3. About 29% are designated as level 2. And the majority, or about 56%, are designated as level 1. So those who are subject to broad public disclosure, as of yesterday, there were 459 registrants subject to broad public disclosure residing in Minnesota communities. 11 of those registrants, the address is unknown, and those registrants are generally those that are not under supervision and may have left the state without telling law enforcement before they left, or they are just avoiding the registration requirements. If they were actually still under active supervision, there would be a warrant out for their arrest if they were non-compliant with registration. So 459 registrants in the entire state. There's only one of those registrants that lives in New Brighton. But as you probably would expect, the metropolitan area is higher populations. So there are more of those level 3s who live in the metropolitan region and in more densely populated areas such as Minneapolis and St. Paul. Those have the largest number of registrants. Now, something to keep in mind is probably one of the worst things that ever sort of got perpetuated in our lives. And I know I grew up with this idea about stranger danger, and that what we had to fear were people abducting children off the street, that this was something that everybody had to worry about. What we really know is that most sexual offenses are not committed by strangers. Those rare, extremely rare stranger type abductions, assaults are the exception. That most sexual offending is done by people who are known to their victims. Unfortunately, when we look at it, we see that about a third of them are committed by family members, and another almost 60% acquaintances. And then 7% are people who are not previously known. And that includes people who just recently met. That definition of stranger means somebody who was not known to the victim more than 24 hours. And then another really interesting statistic that I think is really important when we think about how to keep ourselves and our communities safe is the split on the victims. About a third of the victims are ages 0 to 12. Those are children. Those are what we think of as our community members who are being taken care of. They're not independent. They're the children that are usually being looked after by adults, that they are being monitored very closely. Another third of the victims are those teenage years, 13 to 17. And that's the age that when kids are becoming more independent, they're going out, developing relationships outside the family circle, outside the acquaintance circle. And that's where we end up finding the highest rate of sexual offending also. Because when you look at this, you may say, well, that's only a third of the crimes are committed against teenagers 13 to 17. But that's a smaller age range. The ages 13 to 17 only make up about 9 to 10% of our population, but are fully 33% of the victims. So keep that in mind, that those are the ages that are actually at the highest risk of sexual offending, is in those teen years when, again, kids are much more independent, kind of spreading their wings. And then about a third are adults, and that means anyone from the age of 18 and older. So that's important to keep in mind, both the idea that in most situations, somebody who offends against the victim is already going to be known to that victim, and that higher concern rate should be during those teen years when it is at the highest rate. So Now I'm going to move into the area of specifics about the person who has moved into New Brighton. Want to make sure that part of this community notification takes into account details about the person so that there aren't misconceptions about what their history is. A lot of times people hear the term sex offender and always think of sort of a general idea of that. It is important to understand the behavior and specifics of a person who has been identified as somebody with higher risks and also higher needs in monitoring and supervision. So Antonio Edward Gonzer, also known as Tony Gonzer, is the person. These are fairly recent photographs of him. He's 41 years old, about 5'9", 232 pounds, brown eyes, brown hair, but as you see, it's a little bit bleached there. He's living in the 2200 block of Tioga Boulevard in New Brighton. One of the reasons we don't specifically provide an exact address is that we don't want that published outside of the community. I think if some of you are local residents in that area, you probably know the exact address, something like that, but it's not something we want to broadly share outside your community because we don't want people to look at that address and say they want to go vandalize it. People from outside your community who don't care about your community and may just come in and do something in the community, vandalize or whatever. So what's the history of Mr. Gonzer? He engaged in sexual contact against a known adult female. Contact included penetration. He gained access, asking the victim to have a cigarette with him. She invited him into her home, and then he took advantage of that, used his force, his size, his strength to gain compliance in that situation. It was a 2013 conviction in Ramsey County. He was convicted of criminal sexual conduct in the third degree, a 45-year-old female. He was known to the victim, used that familiarity and kindness to gain and exploit the access. He was given a 48-month or a 4-year prison commit. And then in Minnesota, if somebody is convicted of criminal sexual conduct, they are also given a 10-year period of conditional release, which is essentially an extension of their sentence. It gives the supervising agency the ability to impose restrictions, supervision for 10 years after the release from prison. If the person getting out of prison complies with registration, does everything they need to do, they will not necessarily go back to prison. And at the end of that 10-year period, they're completely done with their sentence. But if they don't comply, if for some reason it's seen as a need to pull that person back into prison for a time, they can do that during that 10-year conditional release period. So he entered prison in 2013. He was released from prison in 2015. He was actually released as a level 2 at that time. He had a limited criminal history, but that risk level 2 allowed, because of other conditions, allowed at least more flexibility with local law enforcement on notification. Almost 3 years later, he was not in compliance with his supervision conditions. It doesn't mean that he committed any new offense. He didn't commit a new crime, but he wasn't following the rules of supervision. So his release was revoked and he was sent back to prison for a period. And then when the review committee looked at him, they decided to bump him up to a level 3. And a lot of that reason was because they felt he had a higher level of needs and monitoring and structure in order for him to succeed in the community. And designating him as a level 3 would allow that more structured supervision in the community. So in October of 2018, he was released back into the community, and he's been out for almost 3 years. Because of through no fault of his own, loss of the residence, the structured residence he was in previously, and that was a sudden change. And that's one of the reasons why this was a quick move, because he lost his residence. Again, it had nothing to do with him, but had to do with the actual residence. That was why he ended up making a quick move to New Brighton on September 11th. And one of the reasons that usually we like to have these notifications done prior to them moving into the community, but in this case, there wasn't that time or option for that. So he has now 5 more years left on his supervision. So during that time, again, if he does not comply with the supervision, there is an opportunity to pull him back into prison. We hope that doesn't happen, because the whole goal of the supervision process is to teach him how he can self-regulate himself, how he can deal with any of those concerns that we have about his ability to live crime-free in the community. So we have another 5 years of working with him in treatment, in development, helping him with that. And then if he does everything right, he will avoid going back to prison and eventually come off supervision. But he will be subject to registration for the rest of his life based on that conviction for criminal sexual conduct. So even after September 12th, 2026, he will still have to notify law enforcement whenever he moves, whenever he changes jobs, whenever he changes his motor vehicle, whenever, if he goes to school, anything like that. So for the rest of his life, he is required to keep local law enforcement informed. And if he's still a level 3, designated as a level 3, he he will be subject to broad public notification. Now, if he does well in the community, he can ask for a reassessment of his risk level. And if he is doing well and those risk factors have reduced based on what his supervising agent says and what the review committee says, they could reduce him down to a level 2 or even a level 1. But still, he always has to report into local law enforcement. So this next 5 years of supervision for him, the important thing to always keep in mind is that the primary objective is public safety. And we want to make sure that he is in compliance with his release conditions and he has a successful reintegration back into the community. And the release conditions he has are fairly restrictive, but what we hope happens is that they're gradually reduced as he demonstrates his ability to comply with them and build his life up so that he's in compliance with laws, regulations, things like that. So if he does very well, what we would hope that by the end of the 5 years, that most of those release conditions have been reduced to such a low level that he won't notice a big change from being on supervision to no longer being on supervision. That's in a perfect world. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. And that's why it's important to have people involved in his life, both social services that may be involved in his life, but also his supervision agent who will be monitoring him very closely over these years. So the release planning process, he got out of prison 3 years ago. What happens there is that whole process is entered through, and as he successfully goes through it, then that release process is not really a release process anymore. We're 3 years into it. It's simply a developing his plan in the community. And our supervision, what we're talking about is, we call it intensive supervised release in Minnesota. That's the highest level of supervision. And when we say that, it doesn't mean that we have bigger hammers and we're enforcing things as much. But really, there are strict requirements, but there are also, we focus on his particular needs. What's going to be most successful working with him? And that means that we focus our attention on those who have the highest number of needs. Those who are lower risk, those level 1s, the idea is in those cases, they probably don't need as many interventions. They don't need as many support systems provided by supervision. So ISR, this intensive supervised release, it's highly structured. It's a reduced caseload size. You'll find that some agents who have sort of a lower risk workload, they may be covering 100 people that they're supervising. But for ISR, it's a very small number that are supervised in this group. They have frequent face-to-face contact. They have random unannounced visits. They can check on people at any time. If they have questions about behavior, location, anything that's happening, they can check on them 24 hours a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's always somebody on duty who can check on this person. That doesn't mean that they're going to be parked outside their house 24 hours a day. It just means that they can make unannounced visits at times. If the person's working and there's question about whether they're showing up for work, the agent can show up there just to check on them. If there's any question about them not being home at night, they can check on them at 2 or 3 in the morning if they think they need to. The important thing is the agents are only going to do that as necessary based on evidence or based on the need for that close monitoring. And the main supervising agent for Mr. Gonzer is Brian Burns, and this is his phone number. So you as community members, you know about Mr. Gonzer. So if you have any concerns about him, if there are any questions about his supervision, you can contact his agent and leave, if you have a question, concern, you have information you think would be useful for the agent, absolutely feel free to contact the agent about that. Mr. Gonzer is in a highly structured living situation. You're probably not going to be seeing him out in the community too much. And when he's out in the community, he's probably going to be accompanied by a staff member, somebody who will be assisting him and monitoring him. So those restrictions that he's under with ISR mean that he doesn't have free rein to just wander around the neighborhood. You're not going to see him just going for a walk. You're not going to see him going out unaccompanied whenever he wants. He's on a very strict schedule. If he leaves his house, it's based on a reason that has been okayed by his agent, and he's been given that time to leave his residence. So if he's working somewhere, he may be leaving to go to work. He may be going for shopping, for picking up food or things like that. But in his highly structured living situation, for him particularly, you're probably not going to see him too much in those situations. Again, because of what's determined are higher needs, he's in a much more structured living situation than many other people might be. But again, you can contact his agent for general questions, providing information. But if you ever have any safety concerns, you think anybody's in danger, or there's any kind of public safety issue of any kind going on in relationship to Mr. Gonzer, absolutely feel free to contact local law enforcement. And if there's any kind of suspicious behavior that looks like any criminal activity may be occurring, absolutely call 911. Let them sort out who needs to respond to that. Call 911 and they will take your information and decide whether an officer needs to be sent directly there, or if they simply need to be contacting the agent and working with the agent on a less time sensitive issue. But if you have any question about it, call 911 and they can sort it out. Let them make those decisions. You can also give the Department of Public Safety a call. Again, general questions. They have that general number too, but not for suspicious behavior. If you think you need a police officer, absolutely call 911. Now, another thing that we really like to bring up in these community discussions is the availability of resources in the community. What we really don't want you to do is focus on one particular person, especially somebody that we've designated as high needs, high monitoring needs. We know about that person. We're very aware of that person, but there are a lot of other issues in the community that aren't subject to this notification. And what we really like to have people do is think about how to keep your community safe. And that's in all aspects. There are plenty of issues that we all need to deal with in our community, and almost none of them have to do with a level 3 living in your community. Most of them have to do with other questionable behavior, other safety concerns, things like that. The Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, I think, is one of the great resources we have in Minnesota. They have a crisis line. If you're concerned about children's safety in your community, they are a great resource to talk to. May not be a particular issue about any particular person. I mean, if you're concerned about a particular person's suspicious behavior, that's where you bring the police in. But if you just want to strengthen your knowledge and your ability to recognize things, organizations like the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center are very helpful. And then also, sometimes these meetings bring up memories or concerns that people have in their own particular life. In Ramsey County, you have this resource, the SOS, Sexual Violence Services. And they also have a crisis center. And if there are any issues at all dealing with sexual violence, remember I talked about that most sexual violence, most sexual assaults involve family members, acquaintances, people who are closely involved in our lives. And that's where most of the issues actually come up. And that's where sometimes getting that assistance from a crisis helpline is very useful. So you've got that SOS, Sexual Violence Services in Ramsey County is very good, a good resource for you. Now, I like to wrap up discussion of this with this important things to keep in mind. We know that the most important way of stopping those who sexually offend is to hold them accountable, is to identify them, hold them accountable. Once we do that, what we've removed from them is their most important tool, and that is secrecy. We have so many of those who sexually offend have offended because they're able to get away with it. in secret because they're offending against people they know. Again, that family members, things like that. So it's important for you to keep that in mind, that we've identified a lot of people who have sexually offended. We have those 18,000 registrants. And what we've seen is that more than 90% of those don't reoffend. And that may surprise people. They think that sex offenders just keep reoffending and they're the same ones who always commit offenses. That would be great if that were true, and then we could just isolate them and then say we're not going to have any more sex offending. But reality is that once they're caught and held accountable, more than 90% of them do not reoffend. 90% of them who do offend know they're victims. Again, that family member, acquaintance. And then 90% of those we catch, and it's the same in every community around the state, is 90% of those we catch offending don't have a previous record for that. So it's not the people who we've caught, we've held accountable, they're on the registry, that are committing all the sex offenses in Minnesota. It's new people who we have not yet identified. That's why we want the public to be aware of what's going on around them. Don't get into your mind the idea that, oh, I don't have to worry because we know where all the sex offenders are. Unfortunately, we don't. We often are not paying attention to that questionable behavior by people in our lives. So we don't want people to be afraid, but we do want people to be aware. Know what is happening in your life, in your circle, and the more aware you are, the less likely that those that you love, that you support, are going to be victimized. Is if you can be aware. There's no perfect way of doing that, and it happens far too often that even when you're completely aware that things happen. But it is one of the greatest defenses we have, is to be aware and not focused on the wrong people. It's not the unknown stranger that we really have to worry about as much. It is the people in our lives that are doing and engaged in behavior that is inappropriate and criminal. So it's not about people it's not about a geographic proximity. It's more about relationship. So it's not that residential proximity. You know, you can say that, oh, we're 75 feet from somebody who's a registrant. Well, they're not the likely person to offend against you. The likely person to offend against you are those people who are in close relationship, regardless of where they physically live. It's how close they are in your relationship, how able they can operate and take advantage of a relationship they're in. So social proximity is more important than geographic proximity. Here are some other resources that can be used. I talked about the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. There's the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There's the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. These are all programs and organizations that can assist. If you don't feel comfortable or you don't think it's appropriate to bring up perhaps some of the issues or questions you have with law enforcement, perhaps you can approach one of these organizations and they can assist in helping you out on these issues. Again, I will always say, if a crime is being committed or you suspect criminal activity is happening, absolutely call local law enforcement and get them involved. But there are situations where you just simply need some support and assistance. Go to one of these organizations and they can help. Again, the local organizations are always probably most helpful. Other resources, as I said, if you want to get into more detail, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension is actually the state organization or agency that keeps the database of all the registrants. They have that information. The Minnesota Department of Corrections, we have that website that lists all level 3s, but I'll tell you, don't focus on those level 3s. Even if you memorize all 429 or 449 of those on the website, that's not going to do you much good, because the more important thing is be aware of those in your life. But we do have research and publications, information that talks about these broader issues if you wanted more of that information. So I've completed all that background information. Now it's time for questions. And, you know, a lot of times we used to have many of these meetings in big public halls. We're not doing that as much these days. So we're doing this at Zoom, but we still want to give you the opportunity to ask those questions. So I'll turn it back over to your public safety director.
Mark, we've had a lot of questions in the chat here. I don't know if you have access to see them. I was trying to keep up with them just from a factual standpoint, really copy and pasting the information that the Department of Corrections, provided to us.
Yeah.
I kind of go back to one of your first slides. You were talking about this program's been around for 24 years. And I think this is only the second time we've had a level 3 move into the city of New Brighton. It's been like over 20 years. I think last time around, after we did the community notification meeting, for some reason, the offender didn't even move into our city. So it became kind of a moot point. So it's a new experience for us as a public safety department too. Obviously, we're familiar with the predatory offender registration process. We have, as you indicated, 30 level 1 and 2 offenders, or maybe non-assigned offenders already here. But could you just explain, and maybe this will cover some of the questions to start, how does he get assigned to here? Or maybe Beth, Brian's supervisor could chime in too and just kind of explain to the viewing public, how is it that a level 3 offender, gets placed in a community or chooses housing or so forth? I think that might be helpful to start from that point.
Yeah, and an important thing about understanding how it works with somebody who's finding a place to live, it's no different for somebody who's getting out of prison or is under supervision, that they are now. There is assistance that's provided from social service agencies that with special needs that people can get that assistance. But the idea that the Department of Corrections or Ramsey County Corrections places people is not really true. What happens is that we are perhaps assisting them in transition, but we work with social service agencies. We work with families. We work with the particular registrant on what are your options. And yes, they may get assistance from many different places, but it's not really as much the idea that they're being placed somewhere as it is that they're finding a place to live. And yes, with the assistance of others.
And Mark,
Anything you wanted to add, Beth?
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Beth Teets. I'm the supervisor for intensive supervision in Ramsey County. I'm Brian Burns' supervisor. Brian absolutely wanted to be here tonight, but with the quickness of the meeting, he had an obligation that he could not get out of. So I will try to do my best in his stead. He has worked with Tony since 2015, and so has quite a long history working with Mr. Gonzer. The most recent release was from prison was in 2018, and Mr. Gonzer has been out in the community since that time and has done quite well, and is, not to get in the weeds about our phases of ISR, but he is on phase 5, which back in the day would have meant that he go off of intensive supervision and actually just be on standard supervision because of his positive adjustment in the community. The reason he is in New Brighton is the assisted living situation that he was in closed unexpectedly. And there were 2 level 3s there, as a matter of fact, that we supervise. One is going to a different jurisdiction. They had to be placed very quickly. And so it was social services and people that work with Mr. Gonzer that found an equally structured environment for him to go to, which is why we're having the meeting tonight. But I know that there was some things in the chat about him driving. That should not be occurring. And if you have seen him driving, I would ask that you absolutely call Agent Burns, and he will follow up. But I saw that in the chat, so I wanted to make sure to address that. Those are sort of the highlights. He's actually, again, done quite well, and has not been returned for any violations since 2018. So he's been out for 4 years, or almost 4 years, in the community.
Yeah, so I can go through quickly some of these, the questions. I think some of them are really easy to answer. First question I have from Zoe said, again, how many are level 3 offenders of the 18,000? There are about 450 in the community. So, and of those, only one of the 450 lives in New Brighton. That's Mr. Gonzer. So you are not overwhelmed in New Brighton with level 3s. Let's see. And the question was about what factors make an offender a level 3. It does tend to be those factors that tend to raise risk. So his ability to and history of how well he does independently will work into that detail. So if he has had troubles working independently, then that is one of those factors. He does not have a long, he doesn't have a big history of sexual offending. That's, for some level 3s, they may have quite a number of offenses, quite a history. His is more limited. But the other factors, the need for assistance and structure are the big contributing factors. We've essentially identified him and say he's one of the higher needs people. So that's why he's a level 3.
Mark, one of the questions we have as an organization, and I think our residents do too, is if he moves out of our community, what's the notification or obligation by either Department of Corrections or Ramsey County or local law enforcement to the community?
Yeah, there's actually a new requirement that if he moves out of the community, that New Brighton Public Safety Department is then required to notify the community that he's moved out of the community. I don't know if that's that valuable, because in most situations when a level 3 lives in a community, they usually have connections, and even if they move out of the community, they may end up visiting, coming back later. So sort of the idea that you say all clear is probably not that effective. What does happen is we do take him off the website, so he will not show up in New Brighton if he moves out of New Brighton and he moves into a new community. A new notification will be done there, just like happened in his last community. Notification was done when he left and moved to New Brighton. Now a new notification is done.
And Mark or Beth, could you speak to specifically, I know it was kind of covered a little bit in the PowerPoint slides, but I think there's been a lot of questions in the chat, if I can summarize them. A lot of people want to know what his, kind of his restrictions are for his intensive, supervision program here, in terms of, a curfew or an ankle monitor. Obviously, driving is a popular topic here too, because people have alleged to see him out driving, which apparently is not allowed for him. So could you just, I think our community is really looking for some reassurance here, because again, this is a new experience for us, having a level 3. And so, we want to provide some concrete answers to people who are living in proximity to this offender in our community now.
Sure, I can take that one. He has quite a few conditions of his supervision, which are all public. There are general conditions of supervision, which are applied to all folks that are on supervised release or intensive supervised release out of the Department of Corrections. But the special conditions that are just for Mr. Gonzer, there are 16 of them. So I will read them if that is helpful for everybody. He must schedule and attend all appointments with medical, mental health providers and follow through with any recommendations of that provider. Number 2, the offender must comply with cognitive behavioral programming as directed by agent or designee. Number 3, the offender must comply with sex offender programming directed by the agent or designee. The offender's refusal to attend or participate in programming as directed by the agent constitutes a violation of this condition. I can tell you he is in compliance with attending sex offender specific treatment. Number 4, the offender must refrain from purchasing, possessing, or allowing in his or her residence any sexually explicit material as defined by policy. Let's see, hold on. Or any sort of imagery that would increase the offender's chances of reoffending. The offender must refrain from entering or accessing any establishment or website that has sexual entertainment as its primary business. Number 5, the offender must disclose to the agent all computers, internet-capable devices, and digital media devices in the offender's possession or control within 24 hours of first possessing or accessing such devices. All devices are subject to search and monitoring. The offender is responsible for any material that is found on those devices. Number 6, the offender must refrain from accessing, creating, or maintaining a personal website, profile, account, password, or social networking website, any chat or chat rooms, programs, which permit persons under the age of 18 to become members or to create any materials on those personal websites. The offender must refrain from creating or using any media method for personal contact or advertisement for solicitation purposes without prior documented approval of agent. The offender must refrain from direct or indirect contact with minors, with vulnerable adults without prior documented approval of the agent. The offender must submit to polygraphs as directed by the agent. The offender must refrain from possessing or obtaining any prescription or supplement designed to improve sexual function without the prior approval of the agent. The offender must comply with any programming for anger management or domestic violence as directed by agent. Number 12, the offender must comply with chemical dependency programming and aftercare as directed by the agent, and must refrain from the possession of all mood altering substances, including alcohol or drug paraphernalia. Number 13, the offender must follow all directives of transportation personnel. Number 14, the offender must comply with all requirements of special supervision, which is intensive supervision. Number 15, the offender must reside and maintain an approved residence and may not change the residence without approval of the agent. And number 16, the offender must comply with electronic surveillance with alcohol monitoring as directed by the agent.
So a lot of the main issues, and I think the things that you as community members should pay attention to, is he engaging in any kind of questionable behavior? I've seen a few comments here about him driving a car alone in the community, and absolutely, if he is doing something like that, go ahead and call the police, call his agent, and that will be looked into. Unfortunately, what I'll find often when things like this are mentioned is that that's actually not the registrant who people are seeing doing certain behaviors. But absolutely, if anybody actually has information on him driving a car, let law enforcement know. They can check into it to see if he's properly registered with an automobile. And that alone is enough to get him charged with failure to register if he is operating a motor vehicle. That's not just a violation of his conditions of release, but it would be a crime. So absolutely report things like that and law enforcement can investigate them.
Beth, there's been a request for you to go back and look from the start of the chat too, to see some of the questions that have been unanswered. I think some other general ones too, and I know, Mark, you talked about it early on and I addressed it in my introduction. This offender moved into our community on the 11th. We found out on the 13th. Well, the paperwork we got on the 13th said he wasn't actually coming till the 18th, which would have given us a little time to do this pre-notice. But then on Tuesday morning, the 14th, we found out he was actually here. Obviously, that's not the ideal format. And but why does housing being lost in another community suddenly become our problem to inherit? I mean, was there like sanitation or condemnation that occurred where he was living that just forced him out suddenly? Or I think people really kind of want to know why such a quick move. Did something happen there that that precipitated this move?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are times when housing is lost and he has to find new housing, and that was the situation in this case, that with almost no notice to Ramsey County Corrections, that his residence, his prior residence, was no longer available, and social services was able to quickly find an alternative place for him to live. It's never the best way of doing that. We would always like to have more notice, more time to do that. It makes everybody scramble, all of us doing these jobs.
A few things I think about the current living situation. We're getting lots of questions in the chat too, that maybe Beth, you could help speak to this too, because Mark said maybe you'd have more familiarity with the type of housing he's living in from a licensing standpoint. I'm obviously familiar with the state statute as it pertains to residential group homes. It says they shall be considered a permitted single-family residential use of property. So it's something that the city can restrict by zoning, having a residential group home in our community. We have residential group homes throughout New Brighton. But Beth, is there something you can speak of specifically to the staffing, to the other residents, to the location? I think even ownership of this facility that he's been selected to reside in.
I can tell you who the program is, but because I'm in corrections, I'm not in the social service realm, and that could be better answered by the Department of Human Services, because they're the ones that license these facilities. So it's called Family Trust Home Health. But you would need to check with them or the Department of Human Services as far as any licensure goes.
Yeah, the important thing that the Department of Corrections does is, and that's Ramsey County Corrections is responsible for this supervision, is that it's not responsible for any other requirements other than making sure that he can be adequately supervised for his conditions of release in this situation. So we don't make determinations about licensing, permits, things like that. If it is an available residence for him, that is provided to his supervising agent. The agent will look into it, make sure that he can be properly supervised and monitored in that living situation.
Is he restricted from having visitors, or does he have any sort of curfew?
I saw that in the chat. I was just going to respond to that. He has a curfew of 10 p.m. But as far as visitors, we wouldn't restrict visitors unless there was some sort of reason to believe that visitor might be a prior victim, something like that. But I can't speak to the rules of the place where he's at. They might have rules around visitors specifically.
The other thing too is just the concerns about proximity. Obviously, if you draw some concentric circles from this residence, it's about 1,000 feet from a couple different churches in our community, about 2,000 feet from, a local elementary school. There's kind of parks in either direction from there. When there's a placement or a selection of housing or finding appropriate housing, I don't know if Mark or Beth, you could talk about what the process is for selecting something based on, an offender's prior history and also the community that they're moving into, if there's, those, or if there's any of those concerns that you look at.
An important thing to keep in mind is we have a long history of supervising people in the community. We know what the risk factors are. We are very familiar with them. And I could just say to, community members, I asked the question, have you ever heard of somebody at a daycare becoming a victim of a sexual assault? And most people will say, absolutely, yes. We know, and we have heard of many examples of that. And then my next question is, and who committed that offense? Was that somebody who lived 4 houses away or 500 feet away that came into that daycare and offended against that victim? No, in every situation, what happens is it's just as I've talked about, it's somebody within that organization, somebody closely associated with those victims. So it's usually somebody, either a staff member, an owner, a family member of staff at that daycare that commits that offense. The same thing is with schools too, is that it's not that people living, there's a magic number of 1,000 feet, that the only people who offend against children at a school live within 1,000 feet of that school. No. What happens is that most cases where there's offending at a school, it's also internal. Where do we hear those stories? It's the coach, it's staff, it's volunteers, it's people within the school. And unfortunately, it's other students too. You don't hear about that as much because those are usually juvenile cases that aren't subject to wide news stories. But it's something we've grown up with. We fear that children are in a school and they may be victimized, but it's not from people outside, it's people inside. So the idea that we should put geographic restrictions, that doesn't solve it doesn't solve anything, because the problem isn't geography. The problem is we have to be aware of those who are associating with our children, who are working with them, dealing with them on a daily basis. And the idea that a stranger from 500 feet away who lives there 500 feet away is going to just walk over to the nearest school, park, daycare, whatever, is a false idea. It's not a real issue of public safety. We would be very concerned if we had somebody whose history said they would walk across the street to a school. Absolutely, that would be taken into account then.
I thought you had a chance to look. Yeah, go ahead. I think you have
Just for previous clarification on where Mr. Gonzer was before New Brighton, he was in a residential neighborhood, similarly structured. I believe there was a in-home daycare on the block. There was a school in the area. And again, he was there for quite some time with no issues whatsoever within that community. And it was a similarly structured living environment that he's in now. So I just wanted to put that out there, that he has been out for quite a while and in a similar area. makeup.
And we are much more concerned about where somebody is during their waking hours, where they're hanging out. That's why there are restrictions. He's not allowed to go into areas that might be questionable. It's those hours when he's awake that we're more concerned about. Where he sleeps at night or where he makes his meals or eats his meals, you know, that's what a house or a residence is about. Again, that proximity, that restrictions, it sounds good and it sort of makes sense to us because we've grown up with those ideas, but that's not real safety for our kids. Real safety for our kids is be aware of who's dealing with them. And, you know, and also just to address that issue of why should he be able to live in a community where there are children? I don't think it is possible really unless we pass laws that said once you commit a sexual offense, you're not allowed to live in any populated area. I mean, we don't have communities where there aren't schools, parks, daycares, whatever. And the idea that says they all have to be banished to isolated areas where there aren't any people is not really very practical. It could be done, but
Beth, you've probably seen these comments in the chat too. A lot of concerns from a home daycare just down the block. I know you mentioned in his previous housing situation, there was also daycare on that block. Practically, what kind of advice can you provide to that caregiver, to the parents, to the families that are using that care facility, in terms of, making them aware of this offender living on the block, in terms of sharing information. Obviously the public fact sheet, is out there, it's available, on our website and so forth, so people can see specifically his physical description, his photo, some of the more details that Mark has already shared with us tonight. But do you have any specific tips that, based on, Mr. Gonser's experience in living in, an environment, not the exact same, because it's not New Brighton, and as you can tell, New Brighton's very concerned about safety. Anything that you can offer us, though?
Well, I would echo what Mark said, which is the awareness, and people know that Tony's there. They have the means to contact Brian should there be any concerns. Again, Tony's offense did not involve children or children in a daycare. So I know that that's not the most comforting thing for people to hear in this sort of meeting. But one of the greatest, things that we look at is somebody's history. And Tony has the one offense, and what we do know is that since he's been released and been in a supported living environment, he's done very well. And that's the hope for anybody that we have coming out of the institutions, is that they can be successful. And when we find the means for them to be successful, that's the hope long-term for everybody in the community. And so again, if people have Brian's number, they have your number with New Brighton Police, that if there's ever a concern, that somebody picks up the phone and says, this is what I saw and this is what my concern is.
yeah, if there's any questionable behavior by him at all, absolutely report that. He knows this meeting is going on. he knows that people know about him. And
Mhm.
he's not going to be wandering around the neighborhood. He's not going to be trying to build up relationships with vulnerable people. If you see anything like that happening with him, absolutely report it, because his supervision team wants to know about that. But, sort of that idea that, again, I go back to what we all grew up, is that those who have sexually offended are sort of like wild dogs that are just waiting to pounce on and grab victims, is not really the reality of how people sexually offend. Even in his case, what did he do? He had built up a relationship and then took advantage of that relationship. And any behavior close to that, yeah, I would question him too. That's the questionable behavior that you should be concerned about. And what we know with his restrictions is that there's probably going to be very little interaction in your community with him, other than perhaps when he comes and goes. And most of those times, he'll probably be accompanied by somebody who will be assisting.
I think our residents are really looking for some clarity here, Mark, in terms of, obviously, we've heard the list of restrictions on what he, is beholden to. What can he be doing? Is he allowed outside of the residence, in his yard, walking about unattended? Can he go for a walk through the neighborhood? Can he be in public places, parks, bus stops, transit, restaurants, things like that? I think these are some of the common questions you even sent me that
Yeah.
you asked at these meetings. So I don't know if you or Beth can kind of answer those. So, because there seems to be kind of a broad, cache of those in our chat right now.
Yeah, he is under this intensive supervised release, which means that his daily calendar has to be okayed by his agent. So if he were going to be okayed to go to a restaurant to eat a meal, that would have to be cleared with his agent, and the agent would have to be comfortable with that and say that that was happening. He's not allowed to just simply decide, oh, he wants to go for a walk and go walking in the neighborhood. He doesn't have that ability. That's a restriction on him, because unless he's cleared that, he can't do it. But yes, in reality, he may end up going to the drugstore. He may be going to a grocery store at times. More limited in his situation because he's in a more structured living situation, but anything he does in the community should not be concerning to anybody. If it is concerning, absolutely report it. We want to know about that. His agent wants to know about it. And if you have any questions about it, speak up.
On behalf of the people in the chat here, I do want to speak up, Mark. I think one thing that keeps coming up too is this allegation that he's been driving around. You've talked about, that'd be a violation because he hasn't registered a vehicle. Is that something for us to follow up on as local law enforcement, or Brian or Beth, if he's, does have a vehicle, or if he's driving? I think that'd be some helpful for us to know how to handle this too.
Yep, I'll definitely be following up with Agent Burns about that, and getting some clarification. And then can I have him reach out to you if he needs further assistance to delineate what's going on?
Absolutely. Just for the viewing audience, I do want people to know, we have a detective assigned specifically to our predatory offender registration program, because as Mark indicated, we do have 30 other you know, individuals who aren't subject to the public notification law that live in our community. This is only the second time, like as I reiterated before, that we've had a level 3. So it's a new experience for us, having not dealt with it for nearly 20 years. So we have a lot of questions for you as well. So I appreciate you sticking around here, Beth and Mark, to help answer them. And you know, our detectives are trying to distill the chat here into the highest level ones that seem to be recurring that aren't just getting directly answered. So I want to make sure that we're asking those of you so that they do get answered. I think
Yeah,
the
and
other-
on the car, absolutely. You as law enforcement have detailed access to registration. So if he is driving, operating a car that he is not registered, you have the ability to arrest him for a violation of the registry. And that's a criminal offense that would be a separate, outside of his supervision. You could arrest him for that alone if he is actually violating registration. And I would advise that if he is doing that, absolutely, you have full authority to investigate and arrest if that is actually happening.
You know, again, just to get back to, just obviously a lot of people living in proximity to him are here online. I think there's some concerns about the people that he's living with currently and potentially in the future. You know, would multiple level 3 offenders ever be placed in the same residence together? I think is kind of one of those hypothetical questions out there. At the same time, too, the care and protection of those existing residents are in our community. How do we assure that they're informed of this as well? Too, obviously, it's a broad public notification. We kind of scrambled to get the word out as best we could with social media, email, word of mouth, things like that, to reach everybody. But any other things that you think that we should be doing as a community, as residents on that block or as an organization together to, help make New Brighton a safer community?
That the household he is living in, that is the most important public safety issue, and the protection of those he's living with is definitely taken into account in this situation. If there are any concerns at all about those that he's living with, that's taken very seriously. And no, he's not. If there is question about that, he would not be allowed to live in that type of situation. And that's much different within a household. That's that private space where we're going to be most concerned about, because that's kind of a veil of secrecy type thing. So that's why those questions, working with people who work in that place, is important. And again, if anybody has concerns about residents there or any kind of activity in that building, absolutely bring it up with the agent and be the eyes and ears. Help in that if there truly are concerns that are being missed.
So
Talk about the DHS licensing of group homes and following up with, in terms of, obviously there's, if we're talking about residents and staff, or how do we assure that, I think you said it was family trust or something. How do we know that their organization are communicating these details to any staff that may interact?
Yep, I can answer that. So part of notification laws actually allow for any place that is licensed. That would be group homes, hospitals, even those sorts of situations. That's not something that we do, but that's something they're required to do, is to notify, to determine level of notification. So generally in, let's say, nursing homes, group homes, those sorts of places, they develop a policy about notifying next of kin. I can tell you that any facility that we would place a level 3 at, well, that DHS would, or that we would authorize, staff are aware of somebody's history. That's important. And to answer another question you asked about, would there ever be more than one level 3? Tony came from another structured living environment where there were 2 level 3s. And like I said earlier, the other one was relocated to a different community. But yes, we have quite a few folks that, not quite a few, I shouldn't say it like that. We have level 3s. We only will approve 3 max in a location. I don't see that occurring here. That's more in some areas of the city where we have 3 level 3s residing in one residence. But yes, we will authorize more than one in one residence.
And it's important to keep in mind that just because Beth said that, I know people are going to hear that as saying, they
Right?
just said that 3 are going to move into this residence.
That's not what I'm
No,
saying.
and it's not.
It's not, but that was the question. Would you ever authorize more than, and the answer to that question is yes, we have and we do. But that is not to say that we're doing that in this instance at all.
I'm going to answer one question in the chat I've seen pop up a couple of times because I know the advertisement just came through, for recipients of the Mounds View Schools, notices there is just coincidentally, a safety seminar class hosted through the Mounds View Community Education Program. So I'm sure if you go to the Mounds View Schools website, go to Community Education, you can find out more information about that. I know the flyer was just sent out today, along with about 8 or 9 other opportunities out there too. So just wanted to make sure we answered that because I kept seeing it pop up. I'm trying to, make sure I've got lots of pieces of paper here from the detectives in the room that have been, again, distilling these questions. Are there specific questions that got put in the chat earlier that we haven't answered yet that Beth, Mark, or I that could address at this time?
Yeah, it's kind of questions here and there. You said he wasn't compliant in his last residence. No, we didn't say that. He was actually compliant in his last residence. He did very well in his last residence.
Some question about, how long, he could live here through the end of his registration period technically, right? And then drop, we don't know, right?
It's possible, but he could also move in 2 months or a year or 2 years or possibly 5 years or even longer. He could be there longer than the 5 years. Keep in mind, this is not a Ramsey County Corrections house. This is simply a residence that he found or that those assisting him from social services found for him. It's not, the Ramsey County Corrections doesn't have a magic wand and say, you shall live here and here and here. It's always usually a combination of working with the actual registrant, working with perhaps their family, working with social service agencies to find out what options does this person have to live. Usually they don't have a lot of options. This was an opportunity. This was an option for him at this time. There's no telling what other opportunities or options he might have somewhere else. If he comes up with another place that he wants to live in or that he has available to him, that can be proposed and once again, we would go through this process to make sure that he can be adequately supervised in that location. So, but we always have to keep in mind, people really don't have a lot of options so to say, bar him from living here, well, the next place, we don't usually find many communities that would say, we wholeheartedly welcome you to live in our community. That's just reality.
Hello? Hello, they're answering the questions now.
Beth, I don't know if you can,
And there was a question about, we've seen him outside alone already. Well, yes, he may be, he can walk outside of his house on the property there. Absolutely, to get a breath of fresh air, to do anything legally in his own yard. But no, he's not going to be just wandering around the neighborhood or the community.
there's some specific questions about, the risk assessment for placing him in that type of environment. I don't know if either of you can answer that, or if that's something for the, the DHS licensing folks or the operators of the home. Mark or Beth, could you weigh in on that?
Well, it's always a combination. Where he ends up living is, it's taken into account who owns the property, who's operating the property. Is he a good fit for that living situation? The agent is always involved because they want to make sure that they can properly supervise and that he is not in a situation where there could be questionable activity going on in that situation. So it's always a combination. It's taken into account. Is this going to be a place where he can do better than he would living on the street? Really?
I don't know if you can explain in general, just, because, you're obviously aware of the, 459 or however many other level 3 offenders that are out in the community elsewhere in the state. You spoke earlier about the type of housing, what makes a single family home versus an apartment versus, residential group home. Obviously, we know there's some that are homeless that are, doing the weekly registry out there as well too. Can you kind of describe how does somebody end up in one of those particular environments? Is that working through the case agent, through DHS, family and friends? Could you help us understand that a little bit?
Again, back to the whole idea that he's in a social services situation where they are assisting him in a structured living situation. Now, if it were an apartment building with a lot of mixed areas, that probably wouldn't be an ideal situation because of that sort of unmonitored type situation. Because there are lots of common areas that are not as easily monitored, but it also depends on who the clientele or who else lives within that residential unit. That's the same thing for a supportive housing situation, that there would be certain cohabitants that would not be ideal in that situation. But if you're in a highly structured living situation, that monitoring is important, and that is also going to be monitored by the agent to make sure that it truly is being monitored within the situation.
Well, and to further clarify, we have folks in all kinds of and through the years, different living situations. We have a level 3 that owned his own home. We've had level 3s live with family. We've had level 3s live in a rental situation where they're paying rent with maybe a roommate. It really depends on the person and what their needs are. And again, we have folks that need additional services through social services, and then they are placed in places that can offer the services that meet their needs. So it's hard to kind of boil that down maybe, because it really depends on the person and what's available to them and what their needs are.
I don't know if it's common in these public notification meetings, and maybe this one's just a little unique because of the housing environment, but certainly we can, I see a lot of people have been putting information in the chat. People are well aware of home ownership, the operation of the home, DHS licensing. Aside from updating our website with, some links to those types of information, would you have any further recommendations on, specific individuals that we should reach out to, or contacts that might help us, follow up and provide some, greater depth of answers, or, reassurance to the community about the process or the housing environment specific to there? Because I understand you can't necessarily speak to it because you don't operate the home, but I think our residents would like some answers on that.
Well, I gave the name of the place, and if you just Google it, it comes up with who runs it. There's contact information. They're actually based out of, I want to say Brooklyn Center, so on the other side of the river, but they seem to operate different locations across the cities. But there was a ton of contact information on there. As far as DHS, I don't really know, but maybe they could point some people who are interested in the DHS realm of who does the licensure for that particular facility.
Okay. Appreciate that. I know I've leaned heavily on both you, Beth, and Mark to get some answers here. And I also want to speak to the community about some questions specific for us in law enforcement here. So I want to take a moment just to acknowledge that. Obviously, our entire organization is aware of the presence of a level 3 sex offender in our community. We have the fact sheet that's been made available to our residents as well, so we're aware of that. Our detectives, who was assigned to the predatory offender registration, has already had an in-person visit and has had contact with Mr. Gonser, so we're well aware of him. Will you be seeing an increased presence of police cars? Not necessarily, but you might. But if a detective is checking into, they might be driving an unmarked, so you never know. In terms of, activity on that particular stretch of roadway, I look, specific, to the address where we were, for the last 2 years under ownership. It appears that we've just had a lot of, or a handful or a half dozen medical assist type calls, what I think would be in general nature with the type of, group home operation that is occurring in that vicinity. So just want to answer a few things that broadly from that standpoint there. But if there's any specific that somebody wants to have for Mark, Beth, or myself, we're kind of getting up to the 2-hour mark here. I want to be respectful of the people's time. I really appreciate it. I think, we've had, at some point nearly, 67 participants. So obviously a very, interested crowd here from the city of New Brighton, which I really expected. So thanks everybody for turning out, answering the questions, and sticking with us as we got through the information and tried to really distill down some of the key ones that people wanted answers to. And unfortunately, not all the people that probably could answer them were here tonight because, we didn't know who they necessarily were, but we'll follow up and try to get some better answers and share that information accordingly. So Mark and Beth, I just want to give you an opportunity too, if there's anything in closing that you want to add, so.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I have never found a community that says, I want this particular person to live in my community. That's the options that somebody who's coming out of prison has are very, very limited, especially if they have higher needs, that it is going to be difficult. I absolutely understand that people have concerns about this, but if there were easy answers, if there were easy solutions to these things, we would use them. But it is a very difficult, problematic situation. What I can say is that in our history of dealing with those under intensive supervised release, we essentially don't have any sexual reoffending by those under this level of supervision. I can't guarantee that there won't be an exception in the future, but all I can talk about is of the hundreds and actual thousands of moves that we've seen of people under the high level of supervision, that we have not seen sexual reoffending. And it's not that we were wrong in assigning people as a level 3, it's that we identified them as having these higher needs. So that's why we've been able to intervene, monitor, have closer look at them. And that is why they actually have such a low recidivism rate. You know, I know that that doesn't give comfort to people, because you look at what he has done in the past. What we know from our experience, long experience, is that we have been able to effectively monitor and supervise these registrants.
And I would just follow up and say what I've been saying this whole time. You see anything that is of concern, please reach out to Agent Byrne
Yes.
immediately.
All right, again, Mark, Beth, thanks for joining us tonight. I just want to thank the viewing audience for joining us as well. For those that are in the live audience, we will be reposting this video on our website for those that were unable to watch it. So if there's anybody that wants to go back and review any portion of it, the information on the offender, again, is on our city website. You know, and the contact information for many of those organizations has been shared in the chat, but we'll make sure that that information is available. Obviously, people are pretty Google savvy and are finding it out there as well. Again, just appreciate you joining us tonight. Obviously, you know, a topic of concern to our community, something that we wanted to hopefully provide some assurance, you know, for you to know what we're doing to make sure that New Brighton's safe for everyone. I know we had a lot of questions tonight, a lot of participants. I really appreciate your patience and willingness as we got through them all tonight. So thank you and be safe out there.
Thank you.
And do feel free, anybody, to give me a call. I know some of you are angry about these answers. If you want to have a one-on-one talk, feel free to give me a call. I'm posting my information right up here. And sometimes it's better to have a one-on-one opportunity to talk and have some of these questions answered than it is in kind of a Zoom format.